I always believed the greatest changes in life came with a sound, an unmistakable snap of fingers, the slam of a door, a click of a phone call that ends something before it even properly began. But as it turned out, when my life took its quietest yet most profound turn, there was no sound at all. Just the soft scrape of a chair on polished wood, a laugh carried over from a neighboring table, and the delicate clink of a teaspoon against porcelain. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that passed unnoticed, like a sigh. I had gone to the small, dim cafe on Green Street, a place where time felt like it stalled, curling up in the corners like old smoke because I needed a moment alone. In truth, I needed more than a moment. I needed to breathe without someone expecting something of me, a meal, an answer, a smile. My marriage to Daniel had settled into that familiar, padded comfort that could either be a blessing or a slow suffocation, depending on the day. After 32 years, I knew every crease of his face, every sigh he would make when reading the newspaper, every way he would avoid certain conversations by pretending he hadn't heard me. The cafe was nearly empty. A few older couples shared pastries without speaking much. A young woman typed frantically at her laptop, and there was a man alone reading a battered book near the window. It wasn't until the waitress, a bright thing with a tired smile, asked if she could seat me near him that I even properly looked. He didn't seem particularly remarkable at first glance. His hair was a little too long for a man his age, threaded with silver that caught the low light. He wore a navy sweater with the sleeves pushed back, revealing strong forearms browned by the sun. His hands were the first thing I noticed, large, square, capable looking. Hands that spoke of a life spent doing things, not just thinking about them. I slid into my seat, unfolded my napkin with the unnecessary care of someone trying to fill the silence, and ordered tea I didn't really want. When I glanced up, he was watching me, not in a predatory way, not even with flirtation. Just a quiet, easy interest, the way one might study an unfamiliar painting whose colors unsettled something inside them. It was almost absurd when he spoke first. "You look like someone who knows the importance of a good cup of tea." I laughed a short, startled sound and immediately felt my cheeks warm. It had been so long since a stranger spoke to me in any way that wasn't purely functional. I hadn't realized how starved I was for it. "I'm more of an optimist," I said, surprising myself. "I keep hoping the next one will be better." His mouth curved into a slow smile, and he set down his book. It was The Old Man and the Sea. Appropriate somehow. "Then you're better than me," he said. I gave up hoping about most things a long time ago. There was no sadness in his voice, just a frankness that invited no pity. It made me curious, the way certain songs you hear once stay lodged behind your ribs, humming faintly when you least expect it. The waitress returned with my tea, and for a moment the spell broke. I added a splash of milk, stirred absently, acutely aware of the man still sitting there, close enough that if either of us shifted, our knees might brush. "Mark," he said then, extending a hand across the small distance between us. "Sylvia," I replied, letting his hand close around mine. His skin was warm, his grip firm, but he released me after a moment, as if understanding instinctively that anything longer would have been too much. We spoke of small things at first. The weather, the stubbornness of the cafe's heating system, how the book he was reading reminded him of his late father. Nothing monumental, nothing that would, to an outside observer, suggest that something irreversible was beginning to root itself between us. Yet even then, I could feel it. A pull. Subtle but insistent, like the faint tug of the tide against an anchored boat. I stayed longer than I had intended. My phone buzzed twice in my purse, Daniel, undoubtedly wondering where his dinner was, but I ignored it, telling myself I deserved this. This conversation, this harmless, buoyant feeling in my chest. When I finally stood to leave, Mark rose too, the old-fashioned gesture touching me more deeply than it should have. "Will you come back?" he asked. "I might," I said, my voice lighter than it had been in years. And I meant it. God help me, I meant it. Outside, the air had cooled, and the street lamps flickered uncertainly against the bruised evening sky. I walked home slowly, the ghost of Mark's smile stitched into the lining of my thoughts, already knowing that I would see him again. Not because I planned it, not because I was bored or angry or seeking revenge, but because somewhere in that dim cafe, with its cracked leather booths and scuffed floors, something had stirred awake in me. Something that had slept too long, lulled by years of predictable affection and careful routine. And once it woke, it was impossible to pretend it hadn't. It was 3 days before I returned to the cafe. I told myself it was coincidence, happenstance, that I merely had errands in town and needed a quiet place to sit afterward. But as I pushed open the heavy glass door, my heart thudded in my chest like the wings of a trapped bird, betraying my own careful lies. The place looked the same. Dim lighting, the low hum of conversation, the smell of coffee, and something sweet baking in the back. And there, at the corner table near the window, sat Mark, exactly as if he had been waiting for me all along. He looked up at the sound of the door, and when his eyes met mine, a slow, unmistakable recognition passed between us. He lifted a hand, not a wave, just a small, private gesture, and before I even realized it, my feet were carrying me toward him. "I saved you a seat," he said simply, motioning to the chair across from him. I smiled, a little breathless, as if I'd been running. "You must be psychic," I said, lowering myself into the chair. "Only with the important things," he replied, and there was something in his voice. Something easy and yet edged with meaning that sent a ripple through me, ... This time, our conversation slid deeper, past the polite waters of weather and books. He told me about his work semi-retired, consulting for small family businesses, and I told him about my volunteer work at the library, my garden, my grown children who called more out of duty than genuine curiosity. "Do you ever miss being muted?" he asked, stirring his coffee slowly. I startled a little at the question. It wasn't something people usually asked, not in that direct, tender way. "Every day," I admitted before I could think better of it. He nodded as if he understood, and in that moment, I realized he wasn't just listening, he was seeing me. The parts of me that had gone invisible at home, blurred into the wallpaper of our settled life. "You know," he said after a pause, "you don't look like someone who should be lonely." I smiled, but there was a lump in my throat. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to me, spoken to the woman I still was beneath the careful layers of wife, mother, respectable neighbor. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for my tea, my fingers trembling slightly. He noticed. Of course he noticed. But he said nothing, giving me the gift of silence, the kind of space that makes breathing easier. When it was time to leave, he stood with me again. It felt natural now, this small courtesy that somehow said more than any compliment. Outside, the day was cooler, with a sharp wind tugging at the edges of my scarf. Mark walked beside me without asking, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his strides easy and unhurried. "You live nearby?" he asked casually. I hesitated. A part of me, a part still bound by the laws of propriety, screamed at me to invent an errand, to turn away, to break whatever fragile thread was spinning itself between us, ... But the other part, the part that had begun to wake, wanted to say yes. "About a 20-minute walk," I said finally. He smiled that slow, knowing smile again, and for a moment, I wondered if he could hear the blood pounding in my ears. "I'll walk with you a little way," he said, and so we did. We walked in comfortable silence past the familiar landmarks of my life, the florist where I bought tulips in spring, The bookstore that never seemed open, the tiny, crooked post office. At one point, our hands brushed, purely by accident and the shock of that brief, unintended touch traveled up my arm like electricity. Neither of us apologized. Neither of us mentioned it. When we reached the turn where I would usually veer off toward home, I paused. "This is me," I said, my voice sounding oddly shy to my own ears. He nodded, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and anticipation. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Me too," I whispered, surprising myself again. We stood there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if the air itself was holding us in place. Then, with a small, almost formal nod, he turned and began walking back the way we had come, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the thinning light. I stood there, watching until he was completely gone. Only then did I head home, my steps slow, my mind a tangled, aching mess. That night, at dinner, Daniel asked if I had remembered to buy his favorite jam at the market. I told him I had forgotten, and he gave a long-suffering sigh, the way he always did when things did not go precisely to plan. I watched him butter his toast with mechanical care, his shoulders hunched over the plate, and I realized, with a sharp pang, that I could not remember the last time I had truly looked at him, not just glanced, not just seen him as a part of my daily landscape, but looked. Guilt flared briefly in my chest, but it was quickly swallowed by something else, something quieter, deeper, a sense of inevitability. I wasn't planning anything, I told myself that night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I wasn't the kind of woman who planned things like this. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, the memory of Mark's hand brushing mine played over and over in my mind. A small wordless promise of the fault lines already cracking under the surface of my careful life. And somewhere deep down I knew, the next time I saw him, I would not pretend we were strangers anymore. The next time I saw Mark, it was raining ... Not the fierce, cleansing kind of rain that rushes in with thunder and passion, but a soft, persistent drizzle that soaked through coats and clung to eyelashes, turning the world into something quieter, more intimate. I hesitated outside the cafe, my hand resting on the cool metal handle of the door. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, a woman in her 50s, hair slightly frizzed from the damp air, lipstick fading, lines of worry etched gently into her forehead. For a moment, I almost turned away. Almost reminded myself of all the reasons to go home, to stay safely tucked into the known dimensions of my life. But then I pushed the door open, and the warm scent of coffee and cinnamon wrapped itself around me like a lover's arms. He was there. Of course he was. Sitting at the same table by the window, his jacket damp from the rain, his book forgotten beside an untouched cup of coffee. When he looked up and saw me, something changed in his face, not surprise, not even delight, something quieter, more profound. A confirmation of what we both already knew but hadn't yet dared to name. Without a word, I crossed the room and slid into the seat opposite him. "You're soaked," he said, his voice low, a touch of laughter dancing at the edges. "So are you," I replied, shrugging off my coat and shaking the rain from my hair. We smiled at each other, and for a moment, it was as if the rain, the cafe, the whole restless city outside had ceased to exist. There was only this table, only us. "I thought you might not come," he said after a while, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Why?" I hesitated. The real answer was heavy on my tongue, aching to be spoken, because I was afraid. Because I knew, even if I couldn't yet say it aloud, that this was no longer harmless. That something real and dangerous was blooming between us, unstoppable as the seasons. Instead, I said simply, "Because it's easier not to." He nodded as if he understood completely. Most things worth doing aren't easy, he said. We talked for hours, the way you do when you are discovering someone who feels both impossibly new and eerily familiar. He told me about his first marriage, long ended, and his estranged daughter who lived 2 states away. I told him about Daniel, though. I spoke carefully, as if mentioning my husband too much might somehow strengthen the tether I already felt fraying inside me. Mark asked questions no one else ever bothered to ask. About my favorite childhood book. About the one place I always dreamed of visiting but never had. About the songs that made me cry, even when I didn't understand why. With Daniel, our conversations had long since narrowed into the practical: bills, groceries, doctor's appointments. With Mark, words felt new again, like a river rushing into a dry, cracked bed. At one point, the waitress brought us fresh coffee without being asked, smiling in that knowing way young people sometimes do when they sense something quietly momentous unfolding before them. The cafe began to empty as afternoon bled into evening, but neither of us moved. The rain outside thickened into a steady curtain, the windows fogging around the edges, blurring the world beyond into smudged watercolor. Mark leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his voice dropping into something more private. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "what your life might have looked like if you'd made just one different choice?" I swallowed, feeling the question land deep in my chest. "All the time," I whispered. He held my gaze, then steady, unflinching, and in that look, I felt the fragile wall between us tremble. Not collapse, not yet, but tremble. When I finally rose to leave, the clock above the counter told me I was already late for dinner. Daniel would be waiting, fork in hand, remote control ready, expecting the ordinary rhythm of our life to resume without interruption. I hesitated at the door, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. Mark rose too, coming to stand beside me. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The space between us was thick with everything we hadn't yet said, but both knew. "I'll walk you to your car," he offered. I walked. I said, "It's not far." He hesitated, then simply nodded. Outside, the rain plastered my hair to my forehead, ran in chilly rivers down the back of my neck. Mark pulled an umbrella from somewhere, his coat pocket, maybe, and opened it with a quick snap, holding it out over us. It was absurdly small, barely enough to cover one person, so we stood closer than we had ever stood before. His shoulder brushed mine with every step. The scent of him, soap, rain, something indefinably masculine, wrapped itself around me more intimately than any touch could have. We said very little as we walked, the rain muffling the world into something soft and secretive. When we reached my street, I stopped, reluctant to break the fragile thread of the moment. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark turned toward me fully then, the umbrella tilting precariously, the rain slipping in cold drips down our backs. For a heartbeat, I thought he might kiss me. I wanted him to. The thought shocked me, and yet it didn't. Not really. Instead, he reached out and gently tucked a strand of wet hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "You're worth getting wet for," he said quietly. And then he stepped back, his hand falling away, the umbrella drooping between us like a curtain. "I'll see you," he said, and his voice held a promise, or maybe a prayer. I watched him walk away again, his figure dissolving into the rain. When I entered the house, Daniel was in the living room, the television flashing images of a news broadcast across his face. "You're late," he said without looking up. "There was traffic," I lied, peeling off my soaked coat and hanging it carefully on the rack. He grunted in response, never lifting his eyes from the screen. Upstairs, I changed into dry clothes, moving slowly, methodically, as if the weight of the day clung to my skin. In the mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself, hair damp, cheeks flushed, eyes brighter than they had been in years. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Or maybe I finally did. Maybe for the first time in decades, I was seeing a version of myself that had never truly gone away. The woman who wanted, the woman who dreamed, the woman who, standing in the rain beside a man who wasn't her husband, had felt the wild, reckless beat of her own heart for the first time in too long. I touched my reflection lightly as if to confirm she was real, and I whispered almost without meaning to, "What are you doing?" But the woman in the mirror only smiled, a small, secret smile, and said nothing at all. The days that followed were a blur of small, meaningless tasks. Laundry, groceries, returning library books, cooking meals that went half uneaten. But underneath it all, like a slow, steady pulse, ran the memory of that afternoon in the rain, the closeness, the touch of his fingers against my skin, the unspoken promise in his eyes. I told myself I would not see him again, that it was better this way, safer, cleaner, easier to slip back into the quiet, colorless life I had built like a nest around myself. But lying to myself had become harder than I expected. On Thursday, when Daniel announced he would be away overnight for a golf tournament with his old college friends, the silence that followed his words was thick with unspoken possibilities. "You'll be all right here by yourself?" he asked, barely glancing up from his packing. "Of course," I said, my voice too casual, too bright. He kissed my cheek absently, perfunctorily, and then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. The house felt cavernous without him, each clock tick magnified, each creaking floorboard a sharp reminder of my aloneness. I didn't call Mark. I didn't have to. He knew. Somehow he knew. That evening, as twilight slipped soft and bruised across the sky, I heard a knock at the door. A knock too familiar, too deliberate to be anything but him. I opened it to find him standing there. No umbrella this time, just the fine mist of rain sparkling in his hair like tiny diamonds. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. I stepped aside and he came in, the door closing behind him with a low, definitive thud. The world outside ceased to exist. We moved toward each other without thinking, drawn by a current too old, too deep to fight. When his arms came around me, it felt like a homecoming to a place I had forgotten existed, a place inside myself I thought had been lost forever. The first kiss was tentative, reverent, a question asked with trembling lips. I answered without hesitation, my fingers sliding into the damp hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the reality of his body, his warmth. There was no frantic tearing of clothes, no breathless urgency, only a slow, deliberate shedding of layers, a quiet reverence for skin revealed under tender hands. When he laid me down, it was with a care that undid me more than any fevered touch could have, as if I were precious, as if he understood that it wasn't just my body being offered, but something far more fragile, something long buried and newly born, time blurred. The rain whispered against the windows. The world narrowed to the heat of his breath against my throat, the low, broken sounds escaping both of us as we moved together. Not out of lust alone, but out of some deeper hunger, some bone-deep need to be seen, to be known. Afterward, we lay tangled together in the dim light, our breathing slowing, our bodies fitting against each other as if shaped for this very purpose. Mark traced lazy circles on my shoulder with his fingertips, and I let myself drift, floating somewhere between regret and wonder. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. I smiled sadly into the hollow of his throat. No one had called me beautiful in a very long time. Not Daniel. Not anyone. The words didn't erase the guilt twisting quietly in my chest, but they softened it, made it something I could bear. I thought I would feel shame. I thought I would feel panic or disgust at myself. But lying there in the small, sacred darkness, I felt only a vast, aching tenderness for him, for myself, for all the lost years and wasted dreams we had each carried like stones in our pockets. I should go, he said after a while, his fingers still drawing patterns against my skin. No, I whispered before I could stop myself. He kissed the top of my head and held me tighter, saying nothing. Later, when he finally rose and dressed in the quiet, I watched him from the bed, my heart full and breaking all at once. At the door, he turned back to me, silhouetted against the soft gold of the porch light. "I'll see you again," he said, not as a question, but as a promise. And I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. After he left, I sat at the window, watching the rain. The night pressed close against the glass, thick and secretive. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I would leave Daniel, or if Mark and I would fade back into the safe, painful shadows of what-ifs and might-have-beens. All I knew was this. For the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I felt alive. Wildly, terribly, beautifully alive. And whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I would not give that feeling back. Not for anything.